Hey there, class. This is Mr. Pritz. We have just finished the book of Joshua, and we are going to take a brief look at an introduction to the next book in our course, which is the book of Judges. So this book is a book of trial and error. The book of Judges follows Israel's first generation actually living in the promised land after Joshua's death. If you remember, the book of Joshua ends with Joshua giving a speech to the leaders, and then he dies. God intended Israel to have him as their personal leader. So while Moses is gone and now Joshua is gone, God intends to still be their leader. He wants to be their leader through the priests. While this may have been the plan, however, it's not what happened, and we'll see how that plays out in the book of Judges. Israel begins a cycle of idolatry and sin. This is the primary theme that we will be looking at in the book of Judges. And this is how the cycle goes. First, because of Israel's idolatry, God allows them to become conquered by other nations. Secondly, Israel would repent. When they repent, God would raise up a judge to save his people, and there would then be peace. As the cycle goes, Israel would then return back to idolatry, and as you can see, it would circle back to number one, where they would become conquered, they would repent, God would raise up a judge to save them, and then they would return back to idolatry. So that's a cycle that is perpetual, and it continues throughout the narrative in this book. So what is the purpose of the book of Judges? The book of Joshua ended with high encouragement and warnings, and in Judges we see why Joshua said what he did. When people, such as Israel, do not remain faithful to God and his covenant, there's an increase in failure and suffering as a result. So we see that where the people fail in following God's commandments, they suffer. And we're going to see that play out in this book. There are four major movements in this narrative. Let's take a look at those. The first movement, Israel fails to drive out all the Canaanites that God had commanded them. So the story begins with disobedience. The narrator provides an overview of the cycle we mentioned above, which sets the stage for the rest of the book. So they start out the narrative with the fact that they had not driven out all of the Canaanites, which were the wicked and sinful people. And so it's setting the stage for a not so good ending. The second movement. The cycle is seen in rapid succession as the first judges rescue Israel in epic, violent fashions before, again, they return to idolatry. So the first movement in the book, we see these judges come onto the scene as they save Israel from the surrounding nations. And then there's a movement towards some major judges that we'll study. Gideon, a lot of us know who Gideon is. He starts out well. He's a coward, but he becomes a faithful warrior in time after he tests God. In his success, his rage and bitterness bring him to murder fellow Israelites for not helping. He leaves Israel to worship an idol he creates. So we see in these major judges, the cycle goes from bad to worse. It's just continuing to spiral down as the story goes. Another major judge is Samson that we're all very familiar with. And while he's the most well-known judge, Samson was an incredible warrior. He was deeply flawed as well. He's promiscuous, violent, arrogant, and has no remorse for his sin. Samson's success comes at the great cost of his personal integrity, and ultimately it costs him his life. So again, we see this cycle play out in the life of Samson. The fourth movement is the final corruption of the people. In the last two stories, we see that not only the leaders of Israel are corrupt, but the people have fully descended into corruption. Where Yahweh is forgotten in Israel, sin reigns, and the people do as they please. It actually says on page 128, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's a scary picture that Judges paints. So some tips for reading this book. We need to read the book of Judges with discernment and wisdom to understand God's role in these stories. So while we will look at the characters and we'll analyze them, Israel and the various judges, we need to also remember we're analyzing the character of God in these stories. What sort of role does he play as a part of the story? We must also realize that these biblical stories show us what happened when Yahweh, Israel's God, was absent from his people. I think that's a major part of the writing of these stories, is to record for the people of Israel, for the future of Israel, what happens when you deny God, when you rid yourself of worshiping and serving God. We see in the story that they descend into moral failure and destruction. We must remember that while there is sin shown in these stories, God is by no means endorsing the sin of the people. God is not happy that his people are sinning. God is not happy that the judges are sinning. God is not happy that the people are spiraling into destruction. It simply reveals what happened. It doesn't show God endorsing or approving what the people are doing. And lastly, this book is a tragic warning of what happens when people deny and rebel against God, but it contains a constant thread of hope. And what is that hope? That hope is that God never leaves his people fully. He allows them to be destroyed at times. He allows the judges to fall and they continue in their cycle of idolatry. But that is only to show that God desires to be their true Father. He desires to be the only thing that they worship, that they have no idols before him. And that when they do have idols, things are not going to go well. But when they rid their lives of those idols, God saves them and the land sees peace. And we know that God is a God of peace. And so while this book may get bogged down with tragic details, difficult stories to read at times, we must always keep in the back of our mind that thread of hope